So I would like to introduce you to Rowena Knapp, otherwise known as Ro, COO at TechNation, who will be facilitating this discussion. And Ro, I believe you have an exciting announcement to share around this particular topic. So Ro, over to you.
Thanks so much, Parveen. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about D&I. As Parveen said, I think it's a subject close to all of our hearts. And about a year ago, like a lot of companies, TechNation started thinking a bit differently about D&I, specifically around how we could implement real change and make sure that the actions don't just become the tick box exercise that unfortunately we've seen happen recently. So I'm really excited today to be able to announce the release of our diversity and inclusion toolkit, and it's to help founders and companies make their growing businesses more inclusive. So this session today is going to cover the effectiveness and the actionable practices from a D&I perspective that we can have. Just to give a little bit of context, the toolkit was developed from a series of interviews with founders, and the main insight that we found is that a lot of founders, as you know, are starved for time, but still enthusiastic about getting on the D&I journey, not quite sure where to start. It is a scary thing to talk about at times. You know, we were worried, will we say the wrong thing? Will we get it right? And I think that the toolkit that as it stands today is the first step and the first iteration into what I hope we can build bigger and better. We worked with a great bunch of people over at the Unmistakable, and we worked with a lot of people, a lot of founders on this. So it's been 12 months in the making, and I'm just so excited to be able to bring this or announce that it's being brought in today. That's a little bit of background, but I'd also like to thank for joining me today. We have Izzy Obeng from Foundervine, Nikhil, Shah, from who we actually partnered with for the AllIn Pledge that Nikhil will talk a little bit about, and we also have Claudia Cohen from Futureproof, who we also partnered with for the toolkit. Hi guys, welcome.
Hello.
How are you this afternoon?
Really well. Excited to learn on this.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to have you talk instead of me. I think, looking back in the last year and looking back at the journey that D&I has taken all of us on, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your own experiences and how you've sort of brought this to life. Nikhil, maybe we could start with you and you could help us understand the AllIn Pledge.
Yeah, absolutely. So quick background for me. I'm a founder and entrepreneur. I started a company called Mixcloud about 12 years ago. And I'm now an advisor, an angel investor in a bunch of other awesome companies. So, firstly, I've got to say, do have a bit of imposter syndrome being on this stage because I'm by no means a D&I expert. So I say that partly to get some empathy, but partly also to kind of prove a point that if I, as someone who is, superficially somewhat successful, can be on this stage feeling nervous and feeling like an imposter, imagine what it's like for people who walk around with that burden every day. So that's just like something I wanted to start off with. As a kind of something to just get us thinking, because there's many people in society who walk around with that and carry that. So from my perspective, my D&I journey in the last year, actually, you summed up a lot of it, Ro, when you talked about the interviews you've been having with founders and the learnings around what the barriers are. A year ago, I went on my own journey as a founder, thinking a lot more about how have I behaved as a leader, how have I behaved as a CEO, as a founder of a company, and what are the mistakes I've made, what are the things I've done right. Talked to so many other people who have built businesses, and I started from the kind of optimistic viewpoint that I believe that startups and scale-ups and founders of these companies really want to do the right thing. They have the right intentions, but there are some barriers in the way. We started thinking about how we can help them overcome some of those barriers. I also fundamentally believe that if we can get companies at an early stage to commit to building the right cultures, then we can design a society in the future that is going to be far more inclusive, because these are the companies of tomorrow. So we've built a project which we're launching also alongside the toolkit called AllIn, and it's essentially a commitment. So we're asking founders to commit to doing the hard work that is required for D&I, for diversity and inclusion, but the important work as well. And also alongside that, we're building a community, because I fundamentally believe that most of the learning, and that's been my experience as a founder, most of the learning comes from peers. So I'll end it there and we can talk more about it over the next half an hour.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. And Claudia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, similar to Nikhil's point that, diversity and inclusion is definitely being spoken about a lot more widely now. And, we're very aware of the fact that in the tech industry, only 15% of people from minority ethnic backgrounds and only 22% of the individuals are female. And I think as the conversation increased more and more, we saw that more companies wanted to actually do something about that, and that's why we created Futureproof. We were actually born out of a recruitment company, LaFosse Associates, and we were asked by a lot of our clients quite a lot to provide diverse shortlists, but the problem was there weren't enough candidates out there, and therefore we decided to actually do something about that and create the next generation of talent. So we've created a coding academy that's completely free for the students for two reasons, really. Firstly, so that we could make sure that we're not just giving opportunities to those with the ability to pay for courses like this, but actually opening it up to all of those with ability. And secondly, so that we can open up the pool to attract a much more diverse candidate pool. And it's not just about training the individuals. We also find them their first role within tech and then support them over a 2-year period. And what we've found is that actually by opening up the barrier and by making our course free, we've been able to have a much more diverse candidate pool within the program. So we have 43% of the people on our course are female, 57% are from minority ethnic backgrounds, 85% are from lower income backgrounds, so they wouldn't have been able to do the course had it been paid for. And actually, I think when people do think about diversity and inclusion, they often talk about race or gender or ethnicity, but I think it's also a lot around diversity of thought, and a lot of the people that we place, 46% are actually career changers. And the biggest bit of feedback that we're getting is that the impact that an ex-accountant or an ex-marketing person or an ex-teacher can have in a tech environment is also as beneficial. So it's been brilliant to see the change, especially over the last year, and we hope to see that grow and continue.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that acceleration of change has been really exciting, and we've only really started that journey. And Izzy, over at Foundervine, you've sort of been at that intersection. I'd love to hear more about that.
Absolutely. So at Foundervine, we have been working over the last 3 years to essentially help more young people from diverse backgrounds start up and scale up businesses. So we work across local government, corporates and educational institutions, helping accelerate founders in different ways. And it's been a real journey. And I say that because no one could have anticipated a global pandemic and then Black Lives Matter kicking off last year, and suddenly we found ourselves at the center of a lot of conversations at different levels about what it meant to build a more inclusive startup ecosystem, what it meant to bring race back onto the agenda and ensure equity amongst different types of people, particularly when it came to access into tech and access into entrepreneurship. So those questions have very much been at the forefront of my mind, and a huge part of my work at the moment is going beyond the kind of controversy around unconscious bias training and setting up diversity policies and all of that, and just really asking ourselves, what does it mean to be a more inclusive leader, and what can we each do as individuals to make sure the organizations we're building or leading are representative of the population. So that's a huge part of my work at the moment.
And in terms of that individual leadership sort of function, how have you seen that demonstrated? So when we think about, when we think about the like, how do we be a more inclusive leader? What does it actually look like?
Yeah, so I think I always think back to that now completely cliched way of describing D&I that we all seem to use. The whole idea that for so long we talked about diversity and now conversations are moving way beyond that. So that analogy of diversity being invited to the party and inclusion being asked if you want to dance, and belonging being actually heading the party planning committee, and then true equity being feeling completely included and part of all of these discussions and fully integrated into organizations. And it's a silly analogy, but I think that there's a big piece that we can all do with really trying to understand, which is, what does it mean at whatever level you are at to really say that I'm going to make a commitment to making sure that this organisation has true diversity of thought, has diversity of leadership at all levels. That could be as simple as looking around your team meeting and asking yourself why a junior colleague who might be from a different background, whatever, isn't speaking, and actually bringing them into the conversation more effectively. It could be looking at your boards, it could be looking at your clients and how you're engaging them. And there's lots of different things that we could all be doing, and we should have that kind of personal sense of responsibility and allyship, and not saying that this is someone else's issue to deal with, but that we all have a responsibility towards being better.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think at Tech Nation, we certainly uncovered that there was a lot of fear about talking about this space, fear of saying the wrong thing, or just fear of generally getting it wrong. And it's interesting, Nikhil, I know you've got a view on this, about how do we create that safety and that psychological safety for these conversations to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. That's so I heard exactly the same thing. I did a ton of kind of qualitative interviews with founders over the last year as we were developing the AllIn project. So yeah, fear of saying the wrong thing. It's challenging because we do live in this increasing cancel culture, which is worrying for people. I think there's a couple of things people can do. The first thing I think I'd say practically, if you're at a certain scale, I'd say maybe 15, 20 people plus, is actually start off, bring in some experts, bring in an expert kind of D&I, a training provider or an organization that can come in and actually facilitate and hold space for your organization, so that you can start that journey with some workshops, some conversations where that organization is actually helping open the space. So we did that at Mixcloud last year, and it was brilliant because they really created that safe environment to start the dialogue. If your organization is smaller than that, then I think, actually it's on the CEO, the leader, the founders to do a little bit of that upskilling themselves and hold that space, because if you're a smaller team, it's going to be hopefully a little bit less pressure. So that's number one, is actually, create that safe space. Number two, I think, approach it like you would approach a lot of other things in business, and do that openly with your team. Say, look, we're going to try things, we're going to experiment, we're going to test, learn, and iterate. We might do something that is, around our culture that may not work, but if it doesn't work, we'll try another experiment. So approach it like you do everything else in work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Claudia, in terms of like normalizing the conversation, I hate that word normally, but normalizing the conversation, what have you found that's helped?
I think, leaders really do hold a key part in normalizing the conversation, because they give, if they can show that they don't know all the answers, but they're willing to learn, then it can give a lot of confidence to people that might not feel that way. And actually, I was listening to one of the panels yesterday around diversity, and Adrian Joseph, the MD of AI and data at BT, said a really interesting point that stuck with me, actually. And it kind of goes back to what Izzy was saying about people not necessarily always feeling comfortable. He talked about the rule of 30%. So the idea is that in a group, there has to be at least 30% of representation for people to feel comfortable. So for example, if there are a group of 10 people and there have to be at least 3, let's say, females within that group for that group to feel comfortable. And I think a lot of the time with D&I, people often look at it as it should be steered by people from minority ethnic backgrounds or from the minority groups that maybe don't always feel comfortable speaking up. But actually, if a leader is speaking up about it and saying that it's something that they're really, passionate about changing, that they might not have all the answers, but give a platform to people to feel more comfortable about it, then I think that's a great place to start.
That's a really good point. Izzy, with all the founders and with all the organisations you've worked, can you think of anyone that you think is getting it right, or any tips that they would have had to how they actually just start the journey?
Absolutely. So I think one thing that I try to remind organisations of is that there's not one right way to do it. I think just starting the conversation and engaging people at all levels is so important. So last year, for example, we launched a 3-year partnership with Lloyds Banking Group designed to get more founders investment ready. And Lloyds have made a huge commitment to supporting inclusion internally within the organisation, but also externally, making sure that they are engaging the communities around them a lot more intentionally. And I think part of what's impressed me so much about their approach is being completely transparent, saying, we haven't got this right, and it hasn't been on the table in the way that it should have been. And we are building leadership around this at every single level, including setting up an independent committee to look into these issues, including empowering employee resource groups, including communicating leadership intentions towards this as well. And I think that we've been working with smaller organisations who are doing the same thing in different ways, actually publicly announcing their commitments to D&I, assigning people who aren't doing it off the side of their desk whilst actually balancing a full-time job, but taking these kind of D&I roles seriously and making sure that they're building that kind of leadership throughout. So there are lots of different ways it can be done. No one size fits all on it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think one of the things, and I'm biased, but one of the things I really love about the D&I toolkit that we launched today is that it looks at the different organizational departments specifically across the board to see how we can have like an impact and how we can start addressing D&I at that sort of deep-rooted level of the organization. Claudia, what do you think people could do differently across the different organizational departments to be better at D&I?
So I think you're right. What's great about the toolkit is that there are some really practical things, and even just going through it, I looked at some of the things that we've learned that we can be doing more practically, and some of the things that we've done is things like looking at our target audience, at the marketing that we're creating, and making sure that the marketing materials are inclusive, considering elements like accessibility and language and representation, and all of the things that we can be doing from that perspective. But I think also it's about having that mindset around continuous learning as well. So to give you an example, so our process to get applicants into the course, we've made the course free, but we have a rigorous assessment process, and part of that is to do a one-stage video interview. And we found from doing some analysis into the data that a lot of neurodiverse candidates were dropping off at that stage because they didn't feel comfortable with the video assessment. And so by having that data and looking into it, we've been able to adapt that process. And that was a really practical thing that it talks about in the toolkit, was around understanding your data and therefore being able to make changes and do something about it. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, and things that we can definitely learn and that we've already started to onboard.
That's awesome. I'm just going to change tack a little bit now. So Nikhil, as a founder of a rapidly scaling company, how do you balance the need to grow a team rapidly and to scale the size of the team, but to still at the same time maintain the diversity in the team?
Yeah, it was an interesting question, because in many ways, scaling the team rapidly is an opportunity for more diversity. I mean, look, the first thing I would say, and I think this is actually a barrier that I've heard from people, is that when they hear the phrase diversity and inclusion, often people jump straight to, oh, that means I've got to hire more non-white males in my executive team or on my board. Like, that's basically, that's what they think they've got to do, which is actually not the case, right? That's not all it is. One of our great partners on the AllIn project, Unleashed, they actually flip it. They talk about inclusion and diversity, because they believe that, because actually I think, in reality, the inclusion has to come first. So if we're going to say this in kind of, I'm not directly answering your question here, but to the entrepreneurs on this, listening to this panel, to say this in your language, there's a difference between a lead metric and a lag metric, right? The lead metric is building inclusion, designing your culture in a way that anyone that joins feels like they can belong and is going to succeed in your organization. That is then going to lead to a more diverse team at all levels, especially at senior levels, right? So you don't start with the objective of, I need to hire a non-white man into this executive board. Actually start with, when people join this company, do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they succeed?
That's a really good point. I mean, Claudia, when you think about the scaling companies that you've worked with, and not just from sort of a headhunting or recruitment point of view, but conscious biasing. We talk about unconscious biasing, but conscious biasing, does it work? I've had conversations, especially in the last year, that things such as pledges or conscious biasing are no longer relevant. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It's really interesting, actually, because I think Nikhil's point is really key, that you can almost see it go the wrong way if people start with the diversity as the key metric that they're trying to, and if they see it as a metric. I think one of the things that we've seen to work really well is that by removing the barriers, so with Futureproof it was around cost, removing that barrier has meant that we've got a much larger pool of applicants. So in terms of the applicant pool, 40% are female, and guess what, 43% of the people on our course are female as a result of that. And I think a lot of businesses, when they look at recruitment, especially when they're starting at junior levels, they create barriers. So they say, we only want to look at people with a computer science degree, or we only look at people from certain educational backgrounds. But if you remove those barriers and then assess everyone based on their ability, I think what we've found at least is that you end up with a much more diverse group of individuals by having that wider talent pool. But then the issue is that at the senior levels, that wider talent pool doesn't exist, because we are now paying for the fact that for the past 15 odd years, this hasn't been top of the agenda for a lot of businesses, and therefore it hasn't been part of the conversation, and people haven't had the opportunities to get into this space. And therefore we do have an unrepresentative tech workforce in comparison to the world that we live in. But I think there are a lot of initiatives like ours and a lot of other ones out there that are trying to change that. So hopefully that will change in the next 15 odd years.
And it's interesting, you were really good on your data points when you introduced yourself. And I think the toolkit's got some really good data, but we struggle, and I struggle personally, with how do we identify using the data where we have issues and where we have problems, and then how do we solve for it from a systematic point of view and not just chase a diversity number such as gender pay gap or ethnicity pay gap. Izzy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on data and how we can use data in a really meaningful way in this space.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I really like about the D&I toolkit is how it breaks down the different things that different departments within organizations can be doing. Diversity isn't something that sits in HR and then occasionally gets communicated to other teams. It kind of really exists at different levels. And when it comes to data, I think so often we can easily discount a lot of the experiences of people from different backgrounds, or who have traditionally been underrepresented as anecdotal. And having that data in place means that you can have kind of meaningful, evidence-based conversations about how we actually move the dial forward. And one of those things is in looking into the number of people from different backgrounds who are coming into the recruitment process. The data routinely shows, particularly when it comes to things like graduate schemes and entry-level roles, that there are different outcomes for different groups of people, and there are different reasons why people drop off earlier than others. And are there things that we can address in terms of how we recruit, how we hire, how we interview, and have that backed up by the data that can improve how we bring people in. And then we also just discussed what that means at leadership levels. The data on what progression looks like, and mentorship and performance development. All those things tell us where we're going wrong in terms of supporting people into the most senior positions and decision-making roles within organizations. So there are different kind of points that different teams within companies can use to really say, hey, we've got a bit of a blocker here, and what can we be doing collectively to really level the playing field for different groups, or kind of be a lot more inclusive within our specific teams.
It's a really good point.
I just want to pick up on one of the things that Izzy did mention there. I just want to double down on that, is the importance, when we talk about data, the importance of the lived experience. So qualitative as well as quantitative data. And I think anyone out there who's built products will know that when you're designing a tech product, when you're redoing your interface, you do qual and quant research. So let's not forget that data isn't just getting people to fill in a survey or looking at the pipeline of candidates. Actually, great leadership means having some real, honest, open conversations with people on your team about what it feels like to be a member of this team.
I think it's a really good point, Nikhil. And I know, you sort of spoke a little bit about the AllIn Pledge earlier, but I'd love to hear more about that in terms of what you sort of set out to achieve and how you feel that we can bring this more to life.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, what we set out to achieve very simply was that, like I mentioned earlier, we're starting from a very optimistic viewpoint that we know that there's lots of founders out there with the right intentions, but a few barriers to get going with some of this stuff around diversity and inclusion. And we also fundamentally believe that this cohort of startups and scale-ups, the kind of companies that TechNation works with, are the companies of tomorrow. These are the companies that are going to really, we're going to see a wholesale shift in the services and products that we use. If we can get in there early and ensure that these companies grow with the right cultures, we're going to see a much more inclusive society in a few years' time. So that's what we set out to achieve. And the how is that, commitment by itself is not enough, right? Like signing pledges, great. You can sign a pledge, stick it in a folder and not really think about it. What I believe needs to change is the amount of conversation that's happening. So, I, as a founder myself, over the last, certainly for the first 5-6 years of building Mixcloud, kind of 2009 to, middle of the decade, I wasn't invited to any events about this topic. I would be invited to a million events about scaling in America, growth hacking your audience and hiring a CTO and all this kind of stuff. But there wasn't a conversation about this stuff, frankly, for founders. But that's changing now. So I think, putting it front and center and then creating an opportunity for people to share and learn knowledge, that's what's going to enable real progress.
Yeah, the term being comfortable with the uncomfortable is a term that I've heard a lot of in the last year. And I just hope that we don't get to a stage where it's no longer uncomfortable. I think it needs to be uncomfortable and we need to sort of continue that. I think you're right there. Izzy, working with the founders as you have, are there any founders that you've found, or are there any sort of strategies that you found have been employed from founders and from mainly senior executives to open up that conversation and to start that belonging conversation, as Nikhil beautifully described?
Absolutely. So I think one of the most interesting things that I found is leaders actually creating time, like actively creating time in their schedules to have non-performance based conversations with direct reports and also individuals more widely in their organizations, just getting to know each other. Because earlier I mentioned the fact that unconscious bias training has been it's been rubbished for so many reasons, and I genuinely believe that it's because it's not being done correctly. And the toolkit does reference unconscious bias testing as part of like a wider piece. And I think so often people think you can bring someone in, pay them to do a thing, and then suddenly everything's fine. Obviously, it doesn't work like that. As human beings, we thrive and we connect through conversations with people different from ourselves. So where senior leaders actually set up that time, whether that's through office hours, whether that's creating more opportunities for colleagues to interact in kind of non-work-based settings, that's when we really start to see people, having the opportunities to share and learn from each other and get that kind of diversity of thought within organizations that we need. And so office hours are one thing. Another thing I've seen work quite well is reverse mentoring. So leaders actually recognizing that there are things that they can learn and be educated on from different employees, and taking opportunities to be mentored by junior colleagues and kind of build their knowledge in that way. Another thing is I mentioned kind of public pledges, actually communicating that you're taking it seriously, because so much of the culture of an organization stems from leadership, and it stems from knowing that if the kind of leadership are taking this thing seriously, then in order to progress, in order to get where you want to go, you should too. And I've seen organizations actually tying senior leadership performance and bonus to inclusion initiatives. I don't know how I feel about that. There are different ways you can do it.
That's a really good point. I think Claudia gave some great examples about how what they're doing and what they're trying to do is to not just open up the dialogue, but give organizations and give people from different backgrounds the more opportunities. Is that something that you'd like to talk a bit about?
Absolutely. So I guess what we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are struggling with tangible ways to actually affect this problem. And Nikhil's point is so key. And we talk about this all the time when we're speaking to prospective clients, that it starts with inclusion. You know, a lot of people, it's called diversity and inclusion, but it actually should be called inclusion and diversity, because you have to have the right environment first for people to thrive and succeed. And that's a really key thing that we look for when we're partnering with organizations. But a key thing that we've seen is that actually, once you do bring in these different individuals from different backgrounds, then it does actually start to change the culture. And a lot of our clients have said that even having a couple of junior individuals in the team who have a different way of thinking and who bring a different perspective has almost, it's caused some of the maybe more senior people in the team who maybe had a bit more of a negative attitude to have a mirror reflected at them and start to think about things a bit differently, which is what it's all about, really, is about. And we've seen, I think, what happens if people don't have diverse teams. I don't know if you've heard the example of how the seat belts were created for men. I don't know if you've heard of this, but essentially when seatbelts were created in the 1950s, it was an all-male team that created seatbelts. And as a result, I think women are 43% more likely until very recently to have a severe injury in an accident than a man, because of the way that it wasn't thought through properly by having a diverse team. And I think in the pledge, in the toolkit, there's a more technical example of that, when I think that they talk about YouTube, and that when the iOS app was launched for uploading videos, 5 to 10% of the videos were actually uploaded upside down, because the team that created it were all right-handed and they didn't think about the people that were left-handed. So I think there's just so many examples of what can happen if people don't think about this, and if they don't do something about it. And, you know, of course, people are trying to do something at the senior level and at leadership level, but as we know, there is a lack of talent in the industry. So the more that we can do to give access to people to get into this industry in the first place, the more that we can impact it for the future, really.
It's so true. I'm just conscious of time, so just a reminder for people that they can submit their Q&A questions within Hopin. We've got about 10 minutes to go. I'm going to talk a little bit about privilege. You know, we've heard a lot of talk about privilege over the last year, and for some people it might have been the first time they've been aware of it and not even realise that they have it. Nikhil, I'd be interested to hear how you think people can now use their privilege to help underrepresented groups and try to level the playing field. I'm under no illusions that it can be levelled straight away, but yeah, privilege.
Yeah, privilege, the big word.
Big P, yeah.
Yeah, the big P that everyone's been hearing a lot about in the last year. And, you know, I guess probably maybe a lot of people are like, well, I don't really understand why people are talking about this all the time. I've certainly personally been on a really big journey in the last year of understanding my privilege. You know, most of that, again, was through structured conversations and training sessions I've been on. And, it, you know, it was really enlightening for me. Like, I kind of thought of myself as, you know, coming from an immigrant background. My mum was a refugee. I was like, well, I don't know that much privilege. But then actually, when I think about it, I was educated at private school. I went to a top tier university. I'm an Indian man. And actually, you know, I might be an ethnic minority, but Indians in tech are actually quite successful. So there's all these things I suddenly started to realize, like, actually, you know, like I have a huge amount of privilege, and it's really important for me to understand how that has helped me in society, but also how other people that haven't come from that kind of level of privilege have constantly got to work that much harder to just, you know, have that same level of confidence in the room. So it's really helped me kind of just understand how to kind of make people in my teams feel more welcome and feel like they can actually show up with the same level of confidence. So I fundamentally believe that it's really important for every leader to actually go on an exercise to understand their privilege. Again, that can be done in a really constructive way, in a really powerful way, with some great training providers. I think there's a load of them in the toolkit. But yeah, then, you know, if you do have privilege, you hold privilege, actually, you know, using the kind of the power that you have as in your startup to actually open opportunities, open doors for people to get into the industry. Claudia's talked about that a lot. Izzy's talked about that. That's what their organizations do. But we've seen the power of that at Mixcloud. You know, we've sent people onto mentoring schemes. We've, you know, engaged with organizations locally in Hackney. And it's actually really beautiful as a company to be involved in your local community, to kind of invite kids in to talks and, you know, actually to feel like you're not just disconnected. You know, there's actually this really big issue in East London where you got in Tower Hamlets, you know, some of the biggest, richest banks alongside the poorest borough in the country. So I think actually creating those connections between the gentrified and the left behind is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If you could do one thing or focus on one thing, Claudia, from a D&I perspective, and one thing alone that you think has the most sort of movement and has the most impact, what would it be?
I think probably unsurprisingly, based on what we do, my one thing would be invest in the future. So, we know that there are issues now, but the way that we can affect that is to invest in the future and invest in, giving opportunities to people from diverse backgrounds to start their career in tech now, so that they can be the tech superstars of the future and they can be leading businesses, and we can have a workforce that is representative of the outside world and the world that we live in. And I think that's what we're all striving for, at least that's what we are. So that would be my one thing.
And Izzy, one thing.
I think for me, and I don't know if I'm cheating, this is slightly more than one thing, but stop seeing diversity as a nice to have and really integrating it with a strategy. I think for too long it's sat as something that we can do over there. That's really great. Thinking about the kind of long-term impact in terms of communities and really building that out into your organization's growth story as well.
That's a really good point. And Nikhil, guess what question you're getting?
Oh, well, surprise.
One thing.
I'm going to slightly cheat. There's two things, but the reason I say two is that I believe that change can happen top down and bottom up. So Claudia's already talked about the talent of tomorrow. And so I'm going to say the top down thing is the talent of today. So the leadership of today, actually getting them to commit, to understand their privilege, and to really actually, do the hard work. I think that's going to lead to a lot of powerful outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That's all we have time for today. I could have talked about this for another hour. So thank you so much, Nikhil and Claudia and Izzy, for today. I think the last year has shown us that we are on this journey, and the toolkit's a great starter. By no way is it the be all and end all, but it's definitely the first step in the right direction. So thank you everyone for their inputs and for helping. And I'd now like to hand back over to Parveen.